So I'm delighted to welcome, I'm Almaz Zelleke. I'm delighted to chair this session on, which is really a workshop on basic income policy and financing options, and I think it flows very nicely from the panel that we had just now. We have two speakers who are going to describe the efforts that they've taken to model the cost and other effects of different basic income policy options in the United States and in Canada. So we're going to start with Max Ghenis, who is the creator of OpenUBI, which is designed to model basic income effects in the United States. And then the second speaker will be Sheila Regehr, head of the Basic Income Canada Network, and she will discuss the work that BICN has done to model different basic income options in Canada. So let's start with Max. Max, about 15 minutes, and then Sheila will have about 15 minutes, and then we will have some discussion back and forth, and then open it up. And we may take a slightly different format after they've made their presentations. So those who are more interested in one can maybe have a more focused conversation with one and with the other as well. Okay? So Max, please go ahead.
Great. Thanks, Almaz. I'll breeze through this. Thought there's a bit more time. So as Almaz mentioned, I'm the founder of OpenUBI. I'm going to talk about how to optimize UBI policy with machine learning. And I want to start just by mentioning I think UBI has come a long way. We've got the Freedom Dividend, this new Lift Plus Act. We've got a lot of different experiments. We've got a lot of support from economists on at least particular forms of UBI, smaller ones maybe than what was described in the previous session. But I think there's still really important questions, such as how's the poverty rate going to change, work incentives, who's going to wear lose, how many people, inequality, and the deficit, especially in the session. I think it's really important. I think this is the most important question, right? How is UBI going to affect me? So I'll come back to this one. There's been some work on these kind of questions on some UBI-like policies. So I mentioned carbon dividend is favored by economists, and there's a group I'll plug that I'm a member of also called Citizens Climate Lobby, which does carbon dividend advocacy. They've sponsored a number of studies that look at the household effects of a carbon dividend, found that it would be highly progressive, that young and old people would benefit the most, and that also minorities would benefit disproportionately. They also have a calculator. You can go to citizensclimatelabbyorg/calculator. You enter some information about your income and the characteristics of your household, and it'll estimate the net effect of carbon dividends for you. This is a revenue neutral proposal. And this is the kind of stuff that I do for UBI policy overall. So I'll give a really quick demo of openubi.org/plans, or you can just go ubiplans.org. And what we're going to look at is the first two plans I've analyzed are from Andrew Yang. So we have the original Freedom Dividend. This is actually a bit off because last night Scott Santens informed me that he's not including Social Security as one of the clawback programs. So actually the deficit is like twice as high as I have right here. But you can kind of get the idea. I'll update that later today. So the Freedom Dividend itself is not an official measure of poverty, but it falls quite a bit. Inequality falls a bit. Median income rises substantially. And also we have the deficit impact. And we can also see what the impact is by decile. And basically, on average, the bottom 9 deciles all benefit from this plan. This is all static analysis, so no labor responses or dynamic effects on the economy. But you can kind of get a sense without any assumptions what the net effect is going to be. And there's also a household calculator, so if you want to specify some stuff about your household, it'll tell you what the net effect is. Here is the net effect for the average household across the US. So we have a substantial net gain, which is a function of $1,400 average UBI per household. That it's $1,000 per person, but there's varying numbers of people per household. And that's subtracted, you subtract from that the tax effect and the benefit effect. And there's also a chart that looks at the distribution of households like this. So it shows on average 64% of all US households would benefit substantially their after-tax income would rise by 5% or more. On the other hand, a quarter of households will have their after-tax income fall by 5% or more. So overall, 70% gain disposable income. And if you, let's say you want to specify your income and the fact that you're receiving benefits, so this kind of household, maybe we also say there's one adult, one child. So now this group also still benefits a little bit less than before. That's mostly a function of the benefits being a bigger part of the pie if they are receiving benefits. So back to the slides. Let's see. Oops. We looked through just now. There's a few metrics that were on that page. So, and there are more that maybe aren't here. So, for example, we have the poverty impact. There's lots of ways to quantify poverty, official, extremes, supplemental poverty measure is sort of known as the best way to do this. But you can also slice it by demographic groups. You might care about inequality impact. There are, again, multiple ways to quantify inequality, such as the Gini index or the share of total income held by the top 1%. You might care about the income distribution. So I have the median income. You might also care about the bottom decile, how that moves with different reforms. Of course, the deficit impact. Work incentives are not modeled right now, but you could consider what's the average marginal tax rate. That's kind of a good overall measure of how work incentives change. And also the disruption. So I think this is a tough one because you can't just look at the average decile charts. You have to figure out on a household level what share of people are maybe better off, worse off by different kind of thresholds. So there's a lot of work being done on using those kind of metrics to assess plans. So I just showed it for the Ying plans. Oh, I didn't mention actually, there's also drop down so you can look at a different plan, which is a revenue neutral version of the Ying plan. So if you want to go to the website, you have that option. But we could also use these metrics to actually assess, to design the plans. So a very simple version of this was doing a deficit impact. So we're sort of optimizing a UBI policy to minimize the deficit impact, or at least set it to 0. There's a lot of optimal taxation theory that addresses also the income distribution. So this basically says, depending on the tax rates, you might get different sorts of groups responding to the labor effects based on higher tax rates. So you can do some optimization to maximize overall growth or overall welfare, sort of the social welfare that was discussed earlier, subject to these tax rate changes. So a good example of this is actually about 20 years old. Sias and Gruber, some of the top economists in the field, have a paper called The Elasticity of Taxable Income. And they say, given the labor response to taxes, the income distribution across different income categories, and the social weights. So this is really what defines the social welfare function, is how much we care about people depending on where they are in the income distribution. You can then calculate the optimal tax rates and also the optimal UBI. So they used UBI as a way to optimize the social welfare function subject to getting some more tax revenue from different tax rates. So you can kind of see this with this chart. So I don't know if I can, let's see. So you've got your elasticities here, that's a labor response. You have the share of people by each income group, so these are income groups. And then you have the social weight, so this is a very simple one where it's basically equal, or it's not quite equal weights, but, and then it calculates the optimal tax rate. So a lot of the stuff with the top 70% tax rate that you've heard, this is from this kind of research. So Sias is the person who said that the 70% rate could be optimal at the top. It often gets neglected that the optimal rates are also quite high usually at the bottom end. But also this kind of thing funds a very generous UBI. And this is the way that they say you can optimize social welfare. There's also a newer paper from Max Casey, who is an economist at Harvard, and he's looking at optimal taxation to design basic income experiments. Very interesting kind of approach. And he's basically saying you might only have the opportunity to do 2 or 3 rounds of UBI experiments, so how can you optimize what kinds of tax and transfer schemes you put out there to get the best estimate of what the best policy is. So we can also apply this to a new type of UBI plan, and I have, I guess, 6 minutes to get to the crux of my presentation. And this is a...
Take a little more time.
Okay, thank you. This is a very extreme proposal. I'm not exactly suggesting it, although, I don't know, I'm kind of bought in, actually. So the idea is you replace all tax deductions and credits. You replace the payroll tax, the alternative minimum tax. You replace all benefits except Medicare and Medicaid. And so this includes Social Security, includes getting rid of the standard deduction. It's really tabula rasa on the tax code. And you're replacing all that with a 50% flat tax on all income, including capital gains, so they would be treated the same as normal income. And this generates quite a bit of extra revenue. And I modeled this with Tax Calculator, which is an open source project for estimating tax liability. Same thing that is powering the Andrew Yang analysis. This generates a lot of money. So 5.2 trillion in additional revenue. That's about a quarter, more than a quarter of GDP. And that translates to a UBI per person, including children, of almost $16,000. If we did this, it would have very dramatic effects. It would virtually eliminate poverty. The only people remaining are people with substantial negative income today, and you could argue that we should discard those, so this is really 100% poverty reduction. Lots of inequality reduction, lots of increase to the median income. It just shifts the whole distribution up and sort of compresses it as well from the top. But there's a lot of disruption. Over a third of individuals are in households that come out behind based on this proposal, and most of those lose 5% or more of their disposable income. So we're starting with this. What if we actually vary the amount by age group, so we don't just do that 16K for everyone, but we vary by children, non-senior adults, and also seniors. This could enable us to reduce or alter some of those metrics that we just saw. So I'll talk about how we could optimize for the share of people who are left worse off, and also the inequality effect, which I'm measuring with the Gini index. So if we want to minimize the losers, recall we started with 34.5% who come out behind today. It's hard to know exactly how you would reduce that share. I think it seems like probably there's some room to improve, but probably setting the child benefit to 0 would free up some more money to give to adults or for seniors, but there would be some households who could be even worse off if you do that. So it's just not clear how you would change these features. So there are 3 variables to tweak that you can optimize, but it actually just boils down to 2. So if you take any 2 of these, the third is basically a mathematical result of the other one because you need to make the revenue neutral. So this is where machine learning can help. Machine learning optimization often involves parameters that have lots of different values, lots of different parameters that control the machine learning. And in this case, what we can do is we can try a different combination of a child UBI and a senior UBI, and then we'll sort of infer what the adult UBI should be from those values. Calculate the percent of people who lose out on that scenario, and then try some other combination, and these optimization algorithms can choose that smartly, so you're sort of exploring different areas you haven't figured out before, but also exploiting areas that you think could be promising in terms of improving the situation. So I repeat this 100 times, and this is the plot over time of how much better it gets. So lower is better, right? And as it does more iterations, it improves. We don't do a lot better, but we do some better. So taking that 34.5 down to 31%. And to do this, you have to have UBIs that vary quite a bit from where we started, which was about 16,000 for every group. So you're looking at about 11,000 per child, 21,000 per adult, and basically nothing for seniors, which is kind of interesting. I think this is because seniors, when they lose out on Social Security, it would actually take quite a bit to make them whole. So it's better off just moving that money into other groups where you would have to do less to make them whole. But if you do this, also the poverty reduction falls a lot. So we basically eliminated poverty before, and we're only cutting less than a quarter of it now. Inequality also falls less than before. And, but we do significantly reduce the share of losers and also big losers. If we optimize for inequality, now we have a different problem on our hands, right? We're not optimizing for the share of people who lose, but we can do the same exercise, and now we can reduce inequality instead of 19%, we can reduce it down to 22%. And this has very different parameters than before as well. So instead of 2,000 per senior, we're looking at about 25,000 per senior. So the point is, right, we can, depending on what your choice is, you're going to get very different results on what your optimal policy looks like. So in this case, also, this is an inequality minimizing approach, and you're looking a lot better from a poverty perspective than the loser minimizing. But some of the other, you're basically compromising some other features for this inequality loss. So values compete, right? This is I think the story here. And there are political and philosophical questions, like how much disruption should we be willing to tolerate if we want to change the distribution fundamentally toward something that's more equal, lower poverty, which we know sort of the more extreme the UBI is, the more it's going to reduce poverty, right? The bigger the check is. But probably if you're going to pay for that, it's going to leave more people worse off as well. So modeling can help. This was a pretty simple application of this kind of approach. It's just a search space of 2 parameters, but if you want to think of expanding it, you could look at how we change the tax rates, how we change the tax brackets even. These turn into potentially dozens of parameters, so it's a very large search space. Also which programs or tax deductions or tax credits we might want to retain. And also there's all the dynamic effects we just saw. This does not include any of that, but you could, that would make the problem more interesting as well. So I think the way to move forward here is figure out, first of all, when we're designing these policies, figuring out as a community what kind of UBI we would like to see. What's not negotiable? I think a lot of us would say has to be cash, has to be universal at least for adults, maybe adult citizens if you ask Andrew Yang, but maybe it goes to everyone. So I think that's kind of a conversation on its own. What is negotiable? I think for me, I feel like the tax rates are negotiable. The types of benefits it replaces are mostly negotiable. A lot of people want not to touch healthcare, not to touch education, and I personally agree with that. But there's a lot of other programs that could maybe improve people's lives if it is replaced with cash. And of course, what metrics are you going to choose? And maybe it's not just one metric. Maybe you have some sort of composite metric that says, this is the set of 5 metrics we think are best encompassing the kind of best UBI policy we could design. And this is a way for us, activists, philosophers, and economists, I think, to work together to figure out how we move forward on making UBI a reality. So thank you very much. If you have questions later.
Thank you, Max. That's very clear and very exciting. Sheila, you're up. I think you're the tag.
No, I write down here, and then what do I do to make it work? I've forgotten that part. What do I do to make it go?
Okay, so I really wish we had some kind of a machine learning thing that would help us do what I'm going to talk about a little bit faster and more simply. It would be really cool. But I'm going to cover a lot of the same kinds of things that Max was talking about, but in real detail. So, and I'm going to try to do it in as generic a way as possible and not confuse everybody with acronyms of Canadian programs and that sort of thing. I've got one here that I'm going to make you listen to. But I want to go through a bit of context. So in looking at the kind of policy options we want to model, we started with principles. I mean, it's grounded in values right from the beginning, and our essential few decisions are made on those values. And in our mind, they didn't really compete all that much. We were very clear about that. We also felt it really important that we deal with the existing tax transfer system that we've got, both federal and provincial. The earlier presentation this morning from Ken Smetters really intrigued me. It did not occur to any of us on the team working on this that we would even think about looking at deficit financing. I mean, that just wasn't there. We have money in the system. We have hundreds of billions of dollars that are mostly going to wealthy people who really don't need those kinds of tax breaks. So, and we have in Canada this system, if you jump down to the bottom here, called the Social Policy Simulation Database and Model, that allows us to plug in different variables, look at how we kind of manipulate policy, and see how it turns out in the existing tax transfer system. So this is like as real information as you can get. We did a little bit outside SPSDM and tried to bring in a few things, but it's mostly based on this. The hard part is that like every time you change something, you have to start from scratch. And then if you get a little perverse outcome that we weren't expecting, it's like, oh my God, what contributed to that? And how can we figure out what that was? So this project has taken longer than we thought. There are other people in Canada who are doing this kind of modeling who, are indicating that it's taking them longer than they thought too. So the other part of the context that's important to understand for Canada is that we have existing basic income-like policies for seniors and children. The children's one is really well done and established, and we left it intact in all of our models and looked only at adults. Seniors policy in Canada is really interesting because it's a mix of demogrant and refundable tax credit models, which complicates things. Our federal provincial structure, like the way the federal United States, causes some complications. Also want to stress that we built on the work of others. I mean, there's a lot that's gone before that we've built on, including the Ontario pilot, and the kind of parameters they set for the work that they were doing. So I'm going to come back to some of the principles and things, but just so that you know what policy options we're looking at. We looked at a whole range of things and then narrowed it down to these three as sort of the big prototypes. Everything else we were looking at was kind of variation on a theme. So the first one is 18 to 64-year-olds. It fills in that gap, and it's structured very similar to child benefits. So it's a refundable tax credit model. The second one is for all adults 18 plus. So that incorporates seniors within the structure, but it also gives us access to all of the seniors' money that's in the system, and we treat seniors pretty well in Canada. And then the third one is the individual universal demogrant for all adults. So child benefits remain the same. Couple of wrinkles. It's in the next slide. I'll show you what our rate is, but our rate is high enough that we don't have a specific amount for disability factored in. We think that actual disability costs, which vary dramatically for people depending on their circumstances, that those really should be covered to meet health needs. We also don't model labor effects. And very deliberately, the report that we're going to provide on this gives a lot more explanation about our assumptions and why we did certain things. And on the labor effects side, it's our understanding that there are competing views on, whether labor gets reduced. Some people will increase their labor supply depending on their circumstances. So we don't think there's convincing evidence on either side to suggest that we should plan in an assumption on that. Okay, so this is the most important starting point. Basic income has a sort of policy fundamental document called the Basic Income We Want. Out of those principles, and there were more in there, I mean, we look at gender equality and that sort of thing too, but some of the key ones that we look at that we can actually model and have metrics for, the most important ones are, you know, we need it to be progressive, and we need it to, you know, gradually reduce the benefit as income increases, and then with higher income, contributions gradually increase. Just a note here on language, we are trying to make this very user-friendly to the public for non-economists like me. We do not talk about winners and losers. Like, we just think we talk about net contributors and net beneficiaries in any given year, because over a lifetime, you know, net beneficiaries and contributors are going to vary. I mean, I'm a case in point. You know, I got refundable tax credits for a while, and now I'm paying, you know, enough in income tax to support lots of other people. So over the lifetime, circumstances change. We want to tackle poverty, so that's why our benefit level, we're still working out numbers, so I'm like cheating and not giving you really hard things. But we're looking at about $22,000, which approximates the different low-income measures that we have. So it's a little bit more than, like, it's closer to 100% of our low-income measure than the Ontario pilot did. And our other sort of goal in this was not just to look at poverty, but to look at middle-class insecurity, both for substantive reasons on its own and for political strategy in terms of getting buy-in to this program. So we wanted less than a 50% reduction rate, and after much discussion opted for 40. And then, I don't know, Almaz, how am I doing for time? I'm not sure how I'm going here. Okay, so I'll give a little example of why the relationship with the tax transfer system is so important. Some people are saying, you know, like, maybe just deficit finance things or something, or that this benefit should be non-taxable. Doesn't matter if it's non-taxable. Whatever it is going to interact with everything else that is going on in the tax system. And if you don't understand that interaction, you don't know what the ultimate outcome is going to be. So, for example, if Canada discovered all of a sudden some great new resource that the world was looking for, and we had a kind of like dividend for this resource like Alaska does, and we distribute it based the way Alaska does, and not knowing anything about how the Alaskan tax system works, if we did this in Canada, it wouldn't work. It would not be of sufficient benefit to really help anybody who's living at a very, very low income standard. It would give middle income earners, you know, like a little bit of extra stuff to play with, maybe, or, you know, like make a few more investments in their kids or something. And for an upper income family, they'd be spending an extra 2 weeks vacationing in Mexico. Like, that's not the outcome we want. That doesn't fit with our principles of reducing poverty and inequality. And it's because of the way the rest of the Canadian tax structure works. And I have this lovely, you can't see this, but this lovely diagram that shows you how unequally people pay taxes in the United States too. So I know it's not just us. So I showed you what our benefit structure looked like. So in Canada, there's a debate about, you know, BICN should really be leading the fore on like what kind of policy we want. We should be the ones presenting an ideal policy. That's not the goal of the work that we're doing. It's not an ideal, but it shows you, you know, how you can do this in a principled way and where you can find resources. And there are lots of other resources that we can't model, but it's to get things moving. And people have been saying, well, you know, if you give people too many options, it just confuses. You have to tell the federal government what you want them to do and make them do it. And in thinking about it, in part, we've kind of done both. Our benefit structure is similar for all of our different options. You know, it's a substantial poverty level fund amount of money that's going to people, and it's being done in a progressive way. All of the rest of it is not about the benefit side, it's about the resourcing side. So that's what all of the rest of this is going to be about. So within SPSDM, we model a whole bunch of different things, and so I've got a list of the places we started in a fairly rough order of where we went. So because our benefit's high, it way exceeds any kind of social assistance rates. So we fold in all of the social assistance cash costs that are currently being distributed by provincial and territorial governments across the country. We also include a portion of social administration costs. Now, part of what our social assistance program does is provide services. Too many services because there's not enough income. So, but we don't want to eliminate all of the ability of social assistance to be able to provide additional sorts of services that people need that aren't directly related to money. So we leave a half of that in the pot. The next thing we do is fold in all of the refundable tax credits that already operate sort of like a basic income. So the federal GST credit, so we have this goods and services tax. And then for low-income people, we have a credit that helps offset the cost of that tax. It's quite low, but it is the most broadly distributed form of basic income, based only on income. There's no other conditions attached to that. We have a workers' tax benefit that does have some complicating conditions. We don't like those conditions, so we roll that program in. And there are provincial equivalents to most of these federal refundable tax credits as well, so we roll that in. And that footnote at the bottom is one of the most confounding issues that took us a lot of work to figure out, was dealing with the fact that all of the provinces and territories in Canada, and I'm sure it's similar in state benefits in the United States, everybody does things differently. And they put different pots of money into different things. So some might have more generous welfare rates, others have lower welfare rates, but higher refundable tax credits. Or they might assist lone parents in one province more and favor people with disabilities in another province more. So it's just like, it's a crazy thing. And if we had done it strictly based on what people are doing and spending now, the province of Quebec would be subsidizing all the rest of us, and we thought politically that wasn't going to work. So we found a sort of per capita formula that assigns each province money based on what we think is a reasonable contribution. We next then start looking at non-refundable tax credits, and Canada's got like this huge array of all kinds of things. Most of them tend to benefit top income deciles, but some of them are kind of confounding because they support middle income earners too, particularly seniors. The example I've given of pension splitting is interesting in Canada. Excuse me. If you are a senior couple, say the husband has had, like a great job and has a huge pension. 3 minutes? Okay. And his wife has been out of the labor force for much of her life. She doesn't have a lot of money. He's allowed to essentially transfer on paper a certain amount of money to her so that they both end up with a lower tax rate. But this is a wealthy couple, and she doesn't actually get that money. I mean, if that were the case, we'd be happier, but it's just a paper transfer, and we have no assurance that she's actually even benefiting from any of this. So we don't like that one, we eliminate it and fold it into our plan. We treat a dollar as a dollar. There was some discussion yesterday about capital gains and things, which has preferential tax rates. We don't like that. We make changes to tax brackets and thresholds to improve progressivity. Quick detour here. Something we don't include, but in Ontario it's really interesting. We have this, when you look at in paying your taxes. There's sort of a special health tax that we pay. It scales up at sort of lower income levels, so the more you earn, the more of this tax you pay. And then you reach about $72,000, I think, and you pay a flat rate $750, up to over $200,000. So somebody earning 70 and somebody earning $200,000 is paying at the same tax bracket. Like, that's ridiculous, and it's not very progressive. So that's an example of how we've manipulated brackets and thresholds to improve progressivity. We don't allow people to sock money into retirement plans to make them eligible for money. You know, if they can afford to sock it away, then they can afford it for current spending too. So the results, as we're doing now, we have one of our options is our middle option is still giving us a little bit of trouble, so we're still modeling with that. But they all have similar results because we've designed them to have similar results. They reduce poverty and inequality by the measures we've talked about. We use Gini coefficients for inequality. We look at gender equality. We look at impacts on the lowest deciles and all the way up. The key difference, so the upfront costs look dramatically different. Option 2 adds significantly to option 1, but it's because mostly there are more people in it, because we include seniors as well. Some other differences, but the big one, the universal one, is like 5 times as much as our refundable tax credit model. But they're all funded. I mean, we've identified the resources within the current tax transfer system to fund all of them. So I think this gets to what Max was talking about in terms of disruption. The difference is that the higher cost options require far more significant policy change in order to keep them fair and progressive. So we would end up with an extremely high first tax bracket rate in order to do our demogrant version. And so my last slide, going forward, as I said again, we don't present this as an ideal basic income, although on the benefit side, I think we sort of do. Like it's got to be good, it's got to be sufficient to get people over that, you know, really low income hump, and it's got to work its way well up into the middle income brackets in order to be effective in Canada. We encourage others to build on our work, explore other possibilities. In the paper, we identify all sorts of other funding sources that we can't model, but maybe somebody else can. Basically, we want governments and the public to understand that in Canada, we can do this, and we've already done half of it for seniors and kids. We've got a lot of the machinery in place. And given what we're all facing in terms of technological disruption, the future of work is a big topic in our country now, politically too, that basic income really is a bigger, faster, and more positively consequential solution than anything else we've got on offer. It simply is a matter of priorities. Thank you.
Thank you, Sheila. And I would like to start the discussion by asking a question, actually 2 questions of my own, if I might, and then what I'd like to do is open up to some general questions, if there are questions about sort of modeling aspects of both, and then we can decide whether we want to kind of split the conversation so that those who are more interested in pursuing the conversation about the American modeling or the Canadian modeling can have a little bit more intense conversation, since we have about half an hour ahead of us. But if I could start with the first question. Both of you have done amazing work. Thank you very much for this on behalf of the entire basic income movements of our 2 countries. I'd like to start out by saying that your modeling does reflect the principles of basic income, in that the basic incomes that you're modeling are unconditional and they are universal, even if we have different models of whether they go to, the same amount goes to children, seniors, etc. You've done that. The third principle that most of us hold as key to a basic income is that it's individual. Am I correct that both of your models are looking at family income when you're modeling your effects of basic income? So Sheila, you gave us a very pertinent example of one of the problems of looking at family income when we're talking about a basic income with this particular tax dodging policy that allows a higher earning spouse to allocate some of his or her income to the lower earning spouse in order to reduce taxes, but without necessarily giving control over that money to that other spouse. So the question is, do you model, excuse me, do you have a way of modeling in your models a truly individual basic income, which I've always assumed would have to have individual taxation as its foundation?
Yes, so I think actually the flat income tax helps with that a lot, because if you have any sort of progressive tax code as we have today, it's basically impossible to not incent some couples on the margin to want to either divorce or get married to reduce their tax liability. But if you have a flat tax, that does not exist. So, and I was actually inspired to do the flat tax in part by someone from Canada at NABIG last year, Samir Nurmohamed, I think, who is really into this idea of a flat income tax, a generous flat income tax funding a per person UBI. So yes, it's fully decomposable into individuals from the family.
Yeah, so this is typically Canadian. Ours is kind of a hybrid. And I think maybe the best way of explaining it, so the first two options are based on household income. The benefits. But the benefit, hello? No.
Yeah.
You can, if I'm like almost eating this thing. So the best way of explaining it, I think, is probably using existing policy. So for seniors, we have this hybrid demo grant. Okay. See, I don't hear anything here at all.
Yeah, now.
The button was on before, Almaz. Okay. So seniors benefits. We have what's called old age security, which is an individual benefit that is unconditional, not based on past labor force participation, all of that. It's not high enough on its own to be a basic income for somebody who doesn't have very much other income. So what we do with that is add a guaranteed income supplement to it. So if there's a couple and they're entitled to an additional $10,000, say, the check would go $5,000 to each spouse. So that's, it's a combination of family and individual. And then our third option, the universal demo grant, is fully individualized.
But is the tax system fully individualized? Or is it based on household?
Well, no, it's hybrid. It's a hybrid of like family income and individual, but like everybody files individually.
Okay, all right.
But
It's progressive.
Your household relationships do matter in there for certain things. You can transfer certain things and whatever, but it is largely individual.
Max, did you want to comment?
And benefits, lots of benefits are based on family, but yeah.
You answered my questions, thanks.
Okay, and then just the second question that I have before I open it up is, are either of your models able to model any kind of wealth tax, not capital gains tax, but tax on accumulated wealth?
In theory, it could. Yeah, I think the blocker on this sort of model, which uses the model from the Open Source Policy Center, the think tank in DC, it's called Tax Calculator. They have a data set based on the current population survey, and that's what I'm using here, with some imputations from IRS data, but this would require imputations from other data sources like the Survey of Consumer Finances, which include wealth. So that's an active project that someone's working on. So once that's complete, then I'm very interested in modeling wealth taxes for sure.
So we could model it if we had one, but we don't have wealth taxes, we don't have inheritance taxes in Canada. One of the very few countries that doesn't. And in our paper, it is in the list of, high on the list of options to consider for other ways of helping to finance a basic income.
Great, thanks very much. So I'd like to open it up to questions from the audience. Again, at first, can we have sort of general questions, if there are any, and if not, then we'll think about sort of splitting the conversation. Do we have any general questions? All the way in the back?
Okay, so my question is, did any of this modeling take into account political feasibility? In Canada this year, we saw the Trudeau government try over and over again to reform the options taxation, which is mostly going to CEOs of big banks. And still, the resistance from political appetite to do the reform has been preventing the progress from occurring. It seems like a lot of these visions have a dozen individual things that need to change, or 24 individual things that need to change. How are we going to get from here to there? And does that matter?
And actually, if I could just say, let's take 3 questions, and then we'll give some time for answering. So I think there was a fresh question here. Down.
Exact same question.
Exact same question. Okay, then a question down here in the front. Wait till the microphone reaches you, sir.
What is the big justification in looking at a family together? Why not individualize it? And even the children could get half of the adults. If adult gets 1,000, child gets 500. And the children will go to the, I guess, whoever has the custody of the children.
Okay. All right, thank you. Do we have another general question? No? Okay, then let's go to answers.
Just one more I could
Okay.
This capital gains tax is such a, people make so much calculation about how to make money out of it. Why not just, if you sell something, you have to pay so much tax on the income that you got, and then if you buy something, then something similar or some other adjustment. Gains tax just doesn't make.
Okay, so treating capital gains income as regular income.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, thanks. Sheila, do you want to go first?
Sure. So going backwards, yeah, so that's exactly what we do. I mean, we have preferential treatment currently for capital gains, and in our modeling, we remove that preferential treatment. So, we use that extra bit of income as funding. On the question of why family, I think the basic answer is that there are economies of scale and sharing that goes on within households. A couple does not need twice as much of everything. In Canada, I'm sure it's the same just about everywhere, housing is, one of the biggest costs that people face. So, a couple doesn't need 2 houses. So there are economies of scale, and there is sharing within households. So that's basically the reason. And then the reason for distributing the benefit checks equally is to ensure that both partners in a couple would get something. Your comment on sort of children's benefits is interesting. Like I said, we already have that in Canada. We have, for families with children 0 to 18, we do have a child amount, and it does, for the most part, go to the mother as the primary caregiver. On Paul's question, yeah. I think the important thing is to put out our vision of what we think a mature basic income really should look like in the first place, and provide as many options as we can for how to fund it, and in a logical order, and to show that there is money in the system. Canada, I think it's been like about 40 years ago that we, or more even, that we had a whole tax review. And I appeared in the House of Commons just a few weeks ago where they were talking exactly the same thing about some of the corporate taxation changes that, you know, just got so much pushback. And one of the members of Parliament said that it might actually be easier to do something like that within the context of a larger tax review and a positive reason to do the tax review, so that you actually have a plan to distribute the income better, and then that can fund a basic income. In the end, it becomes political decisions, and I mean, I worked in federal government for almost 3 decades, and like, you never know from one day to the next what really is going to be the tipping point where, you know, there's enough evidence, there's enough worry about the future of work, there's enough, you know, something out there that will make the politicians act, or enough need to buy votes in the upcoming election, which is how most of our tax credits have ended up in the system.
Yeah, so also working backwards, let's see, I think it was the capital gains question, same as Sheila, so treating capital gains as normal income. I don't think that necessarily needs to be central to any potential UBI policy, but it makes things easier to raise more money. And then to I think the second question was about family income. I think that's another area where potentially you could be able to separate that from UBI, especially the family taxation. But I agree with Almaz that UBI is fundamentally about empowering individuals, and part of that is ensuring that the tax system also is empowering individuals and not sort of forcing these people to maybe stay in unhealthy relationships. And I think the only way to do that is to do things like removing the standard deduction and having a flat tax instead of a progressive tax. And pairing those with the UBI can be extremely progressive together. And this is something I think in general gets missed a lot in the tax debate, is that we talk about progressive taxation, but if you look at the US compared to other countries, especially in Europe, they have much flatter taxes than we do, but they have higher benefits, higher overall taxes. So your median household is paying higher taxes, and they are able to reduce inequality substantially more because they have that sort of flatter system that raises a lot more revenue that can provide generous benefits. And I think having UBI combined with these more flat taxes has the benefit of empowering individuals while also producing a very progressive system. And then around the political incentives, I think there's a lot of factors. I mean, that's a whole area of empirical research. But one area that I've tried to model that is looking at these contributors and beneficiaries, or winners and losers. And I think at some point, at least, legislators do look out for, are my constituents going to benefit overall? And constituent groups are going to say, maybe nonprofit groups that represent certain demographic groups are also going to wonder if their members are going to benefit or be hurt by different policies before taking a stance on it. There are lots of other factors, but I do think at least trying to minimize the number of people who are sort of put in a contribution position can make things more politically viable.
Did you want to add something?
Yeah, if I could add one more thing, just, again, this is a very Canadian way of doing things. We rarely like big bang types of approaches, although we did it with healthcare and it worked and it's like iconic. But most other things, so the political history of child benefits is something that I think is like always in our minds as we're looking at bringing in a basic income. So the child poverty, anti-poverty lobbyists developed a very clear proposal for what a child benefit should look like and what the structure should look like and what the amount should be based on like actual research into the costs of raising children. So it was grounded in something very solid. The amount that they proposed was reasonable and real, But we didn't start there. We started at a much lower level, but we started with a new benefit structure that was negotiated across the federal and provincial and territorial governments so that it combined a whole mishmash of different things that were going out in convoluted ways into something that was much more organized and, you know, focused on reaching the people that really needed to reach. And the fact that the new structure was in there then made it easy to just keep, you know, it's working, let's put more money into it. It's still really working, let's put more money. So we now are at, you know, like a few years, several years later, we now are at the benefit level, you know, that was proposed initially. So we've got a mature program now, but I think getting the infrastructure in place is really important.
Yeah, I think that's a good point for UBI advocates to keep in mind, right? That we can start smaller, but if we start with a program that's...
Now, I'm not advocating that. I want to make that clear.
We can, and it can expand over time. But yes, we would all like to start at the top, certainly. Okay, so why don't we take now maybe 3 questions for Sheila on the Canadian model, and then we will do the same for Max. So, okay, over here.
Thank you. So Sheila, one of the weird things about Canada, of course, is that the last time the provinces and the feds agreed on anything, I think, was healthcare 40 years ago. So given that your model assumes spending for social assistance being folded into the federal, into a national basic income, are you thinking that the provinces would cede, is it ceding taxing authority or transfer to the feds to then recycle into a basic income? How do you propose kind of that money making its way across the country?
All right, do we have other questions for Canada? I see you in the back, you've already asked a question. I just want to see if there's anyone else who has a question who hasn't asked yet. Okay, then let's go ahead.
Sheila, if someone were to propose, for example, that the child benefit no longer end at 18 for any child, like just a policy proposal for the sake of argument, for any child who's currently 16 or under, it won't end at 18. You're going to continue to have that amount transferred to you instead of to your parents for your foreseeable future until the policy changes. That is not the basic income you want. That is a very small percentage of the population. A lot of people are excluded that are currently in poverty. It's not the basic income you want. But could you see yourself supporting a policy proposal that is easily implementable like that and iterating towards the basic income you want? Or do you really need to be fighting for what I feel is politically difficult models?
If there is not another question. Okay, so let's go ahead, Sheila.
Okay, so to James's question, because he worked in provincial government, he probably knows the answer to this better than I do. I don't know how the mechanics of all of that are going to work, but I spent quite a number of years working for the National Council of Welfare in Canada, which produced reports on welfare incomes, the only reporting that sort of compared what was happening across the country, complete dog's breakfast. And we also did cross-country tours, meeting with people living in poverty, with the agencies and organizations who were working to support them, and with municipalities and provincial governments involved in poverty reduction strategies. And I mean, the one big conclusion of all of that was that nobody likes social assistance. Nobody likes it. I can't speak for a province, but like, I would be happy to get rid of it. Like, it's just, it's horrible. Like, nothing ever gets better. And you have this constant pressure of dealing with a population that's not popular, and then it's bad politically. Like, you can't get good press out of that for anything. So I would think provinces would be happy to give it up for something else. And then on Paul's question, interesting, I also heard a recommendation at a health conference from somebody talking about doing it from the opposite end of the age spectrum, just removing the age limit on the old age security guaranteed income supplement. So that would get you at a much higher level. That would get you at, you know, like $19,000 or so for an individual. So if you just take that age limit off, so you don't have to be 65, everything else applies. You have to have lived in Canada for a certain amount of time, whatever. So I don't think it's that easy, but I think working in from the ends like that, I think the importance of doing our modeling and showing the principled approach to this is to show, I mean, in a way, it is a way of providing the analytical framework and the metrics to know whether you're moving towards the kind of basic income you want, or you're going sideways and it's going to divert you from, where you eventually want to get to, presuming that, you might not get to exactly what you want right off the bat.
Thank you. Let's have a set of questions for Max on the US side. Mike, in the front.
The slides went by really quickly, so I look forward to being able to see them and go over them more slowly. But you said at one point that the bottom 9 deciles were net beneficiaries of the Andrew Yang type model that you looked at. But then you also said that 1/4 suffered 5% or more decline in income. So those didn't seem to be compatible results. So I wondered if you could explain that.
Okay, let's see if we have a couple more questions. Well, I will add a question onto that, which is somewhat related. I'm curious, Max, about how you modeled the VAT. Andrew Yang's proposal to finance his freedom dividend with a VAT, since that's not a tax that we currently have. And similar to Mike, my understanding has always been that VATs are a little bit more regressive. So it was surprising to me to see that the benefits went into the 90th, up to the 90th decile, the positive benefit. So if you could address those two questions.
Yeah, so the bottom 9 deciles versus 70% of people who benefit, and then I think a quarter of people who, 70% benefit and a quarter of people lose significantly. Basically within each decile, what that's summarizing is the aggregate income today of the bottom decile versus the aggregate income of that bottom decile in the reform. There's a lot of heterogeneity in that decile. So actually even within the bottom lowest earners, there's still about 20% of people who come out worse off. And the reason for that is, in Andrew Yang's plan specifically, is that the way his financing works in part, there are 6 different funding mechanisms. One of them is saying if you get benefits that exceed $1,000 a month, you can just keep those if you want. So I model people sort of choosing the choice that makes most sense for them. So if people are getting more than $1,000 a month today, they're basically seeing no change except for the new taxes on value-added tax and also corporate carbon tax and other taxes. So basically, it's a difference between grouping deciles versus looking at the individual. And consequent, in the same way, I think there are actually people in the top decile who will still come out ahead, potentially, depending on their form of income. So, and then on the VAT, I guess I'll list Andrew Yang's funding mechanisms as far as I know, unless he's made some changes on Twitter recently or something. But basically, there's a VAT, which he estimates to be about $800 billion, and that's a 10% VAT. There's a financial transaction tax. There's a carbon tax. He also lifts the limit on the payroll tax, the Social Security payroll tax, and also treats capital gains as normal income. And then the last piece of it is allowing people to choose between UBI and benefits. So that sort of both reduces the number of people who get UBI and also reduces the payout of existing benefits for people who choose the UBI over their existing benefits. So those all together are quite a progressive set of taxes, especially the payroll tax change and the capital gains change are very progressive. The carbon tax is roughly flat. I use an estimate from the Treasury Department, which shows that the incidence is basically flat there. Financial transactions tax is also a bit progressive. And then the VAT is somewhat regressive. So I use an analysis from the Tax Policy Center at the Urban Brookings Institute. And they estimate that I think the top decile pays about a quarter less than the bottom, top quartile pays about a quarter less as a share of income with a VAT compared to the bottom. But, so all of those together are pretty progressive, but even if you took a VAT by itself and turned that into a UBI, I haven't done this myself, but I'd be quite confident that the net result would be very progressive, just because the same reason a carbon dividend, it may be flat in terms of the incidence of the carbon tax, but once you return that to families, $1,000 a month or even $100 a month means a lot more to that bottom decile. It's going to increase their total disposable income at a far greater rate than giving it to someone in the top decile.
And just one more clarification on Yang's proposal. Social Security is maintained for those who want to continue to receive Social Security as opposed to the BI, to the freedom dividend.
Yes, although this is the piece I had missed. He actually clarified that in a tweet a couple weeks ago. Before that, he had said that the replacement benefits would fund about $600 billion, and that turns out not to be possible if you're not replacing some Social Security. So if you go to openubi.org right now, open-ubi.org, you'll see a report that does not treat Social Security the way that Yang wants to. So I'll fix that.
We have time for about maybe one or two more questions. If anyone has any questions that they'd like to ask in this forum, otherwise we can.
Can I comment on that?
Oh, sure. Sorry. Go ahead, Sheila.
I was just gonna, the question was directed to you, but it's interesting because, our GST is like a VAT. And when we were, scouting around looking for different ways of potentially funding basic income and needed to find just a little bit more money, we did test increasing our value-added tax by just a small amount, like 1 or 2 points maybe. And there have been recommendations for funding a basic income in Canada with an increase in GST points. So we modeled it. It's not the worst thing in the world, but it is slightly regressive, and we found we'd have to make adjustments to the basic income at the lower end to make sure it retained its value, and it just got rather complicated. So we went elsewhere.
Thanks. All right. If there are no final, we have one final question. Okay, over here in the second row. One second, let's wait for the microphone.
Sorry, real quick, I just realized I didn't quite answer your question about how I did the VAT. And I mentioned there was a Tax Policy Center analysis that looked at the incidence by income group, so I used that. I think in the future, I would like to use the actual consumption data, because that doesn't capture the heterogeneity within each income group. So that basically says there's probably more heterogeneity in the overall effect of Andrew Yang's plan than what I currently have modeled. So.
All right, so final question.
Basic income per child, hello?
Yes.
The basic income per child probably evolved from something less than now it is, as mentioned by you. So if you could explain, maybe I have missed because I came late. So if you could explain to me what's the current form of the basic income per child.
What's the current level of the child benefit in Canada?
Oh boy, I don't have an exact number, but at its maximum level per child for a young child, I think it's around $6,000.
And is that, you said at the maximum level, is it scaled to income?
Yes,
So it's means tested, in a sense.
it's income tested.
Income tested.
We don't call that means test. It's just, it's an income test, yeah. But all done through the tax system.
But my understanding is it's mostly at the just very top, like the top decile have it phase out, but most of it, is that still the way?
Oh yeah,
It used to be
the
universal,
vast
right?
majority of families will get some benefit out of this. Yeah. Even in our earlier version of this with a far less generous thing, by the time my kids grew up, I was getting like the check for $6 a month that I thought might better go to somebody else. But yeah, it scales up quite high.
But it's flat to about 50
50,000 before any scaling is.
It's a flat benefit up to about 50,000 Canadian dollars of income for the family.
Yeah.
And then it's income tested after that.
Yes.
Great, thank you. All right,